Good. Well, it's very nice to be here and to be able to talk to you about this topic here, God, Science and Faith, Richard Dawkins versus C.S. Lewis on the meaning of life. This is a sample lecture. And why did I choose these people? Well, you know, Dawkins is an Oxford person, C.S. Lewis is an Oxford person. I know he went to Cambridge at the end of his career, but, you know, all this good stuff was done here at Oxford. And these are the kind of questions we talk about a lot here. So in effect, what I'm going to do is open up some big questions and just explore them with you. And I'm pitching this at the level of first-year undergraduates. So I think you'll be able to follow it. And of course, that raises the question, well, you know, what's the lecture meant to do? And I'm going to suggest that it's meant to do several things, and you can decide whether I succeeded or not. I think the first thing is to be interesting. I mean, there's just no point in talking and being dull because you just don't absorb, you don't reflect, you don't engage. But more importantly, I think, it's the whole idea of providing information. I know lectures are criticized a lot for kind of way packing too much information in too short a time, but it is a way of, in effect, having somebody who's thought about something, in effect, tell you what they found and help you to begin to realize what is there. In other words, drawing you a map of intellectual territory and letting you begin to explore it. Obviously, you explore further on your own, but at least it gets you started. Also, it helps you make connections, sometimes connections you have not already made. Where in effect, in this lecture on Dawkins and Lewis, I will make some connections, and I'm sure some of you will have thought of some of them, but I doubt if all of you will have thought of all of them. And it's that whole idea of, in effect, expanding your imaginative grasp of the topic, and in effect helping you to make those connections that I think are both interesting and important. And also to challenge your limits. In effect, to say, look, this is something you may not be familiar with, but you ought to be. This is, in effect, an invitation to go deeper, an invitation to go further. I won't be doing much of that in this lecture, but every now and then there'll be teasers where I'm just saying, look, you need to know about this, and there's a lot more there that you can discover. Then I think also to explore possibilities, to raise questions, in effect, to leave you saying, well, if that's right, what about this? It, in effect, is trying to give you a framework for moving on, not simply providing you with information, you can get that in the book, but rather trying to open up big questions. And I think if I can just say most importantly of all, is simply to make you want to take things further by yourself. In many ways, that's what a lecture is there for. It cannot say everything, but what it can do, in effect, is begin the conversation, which you then pursue further in your own time. So having said that, let's begin to talk about theology, about the relationship of science and faith, about some philosophical issues. And let me begin by saying that my own background actually was not originally in theology at all. My first degree here at Oxford was in chemistry, and then my first doctorate was in molecular biophysics. And then I transitioned to theology back in 1976. I need to say to you that that was a very difficult transition. Coming from natural sciences to theology was a very different way of thinking. But I do want to say two things to you very, very clearly. Number one, theology is really interesting. Although my professional capacity is very much theology and science, actually theology itself is really interesting. And secondly, it is done really well here. There are people here, there are resources here that I think will help you a lot. Let's begin by looking at the two central figures of this lecture. Richard Dawkins is a name you will all know. Basically, Dawkins is, or was before his retirement, the public professor of the understanding of science here at Oxford. That's what he looks like. And his two books I'd single out are The Selfish Gene, which I remember reading when I was a scientist back in 1977. As it happened, I was a year late on this one. And more recently, of course, his book, The God Delusion, which is widely seen as the manifesto of the movement that we now call the New Atheism, which was quite big for a while, although I think it is now really fading away. But certainly Dawkins raises lots of interesting questions about, for example, the cultural authority of science, about whether you prove everything you believe, about the limits on human knowledge. And these are all big questions. And that's why I want to look at Dawkins in this lecture, because he does open up these big questions in a very engaging way, and that, to me, is the mark of an interesting thinker. Then, of course, there's C.S. Lewis. Lewis, of course, was a humanities person, best known, I think, nowadays for his books on Christianity, particularly Mere Christianity, and his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. But of course, professionally, Lewis was very much engaged with the study of English literature, particularly Renaissance English literature, but made connections between literature and faith, and of course, the whole question of how you make sense of life and how you actually convey what you have found in words. And for Lewis, one of the big questions is the whole way in which language functions, how you're able to use words which are not merely descriptive, but are elicitive. In other words, they evoke emotion, they engage you, they make you excited, they don't just inform. And as you'll see for Lewis, this has to involve a link between the reason and the imagination. And I'll be exploring that with you in a moment. And of course, these are two people with very different life trajectories. Dawkins was an evolutionary biologist. He moved from Anglicanism to atheism, probably in his late teens, early 20s. I think that basically for Dawkins, according to his own autobiography, the key thing was his sense that Darwinism as a metaphysical system in effect offered a much more satisfactory explanatory framework for making sense of our world than belief in God. So that's Dawkins going in that direction. Of course, as many of you will know, Lewis moved in the opposite direction. He studied classics and English here at Oxford, and his own faith trajectory is moving from atheism, which he held up until he was about 30, to what he calls mere Christianity. In other words, a form of Christianity which is not denominationally specific, even though it's denominationally engaged. In other words, Lewis would say, well, in his own case, he would always say, I'm a layman of the Church of England, but he didn't actually like the Church of England all that much. It was just where he perched. And he basically argued that you could perch wherever you liked. But what was important was a sort of classic consensual orthodoxy that Lewis described as mere Christianity. So what sort of questions do they open up? Well, I want to suggest that, these guys open up between them some of the big questions that you think about in theology, philosophy of religion, the whole field of science of religion, which I'll come to in a moment. What is faith? Is faith an intellectual perversion? Or is it just, in effect, the way things are? Let's get used to it. What are the grounds of faith? What are its outcomes? The relation of reason and the imagination. Is imagination something that leads us away from the truth by encouraging us to invent false worlds? Or is it an integral aspect of our capacity to gain a sense of what the world is all about? And the key question for both these guys, is there a big picture of life and the universe? For Dawkins, it's what he calls universal Darwinism. For Lewis, it's Christianity in the classic sense as he understands it. But certainly this is a major issue. In fact, last term at Oxford, we had a whole series of seminars on precisely this question. The whole theme of meaning in life, how you ascertain it, how you apply it. And certainly it's a relevant question. And from my own perspective, someone who is very much concerned about the relationship with science and religion, both these guys are key dialogue partners. One of the things I want to say about theology is that if theology is self-confident, it doesn't become arrogant. Instead, it becomes engaged. It wants to talk to other people. It wants to have conversations knowing that these might be challenging, but they also can be enriching. And certainly science of religion here at Oxford is taken very, very seriously. It's very popular, I have to say, with our undergraduates. And that's because basically it is really opening up a dialogue between two massive presences in Western culture, namely science and religion. So these guys are interesting. So let's begin to look at a question here. Is faith reasonable? Now, those of you who are kind of way the sort of people we hope will come to Oxford will be saying, well, actually, before we go any further, we need to know exactly what the word faith means and exactly what criteria you are using to, in effect, defend this word reasonable. So there's a lot of groundwork we need to do here. But the key point to make here is basically that there is basically a very strong polarity here. Dawkins, in effect, saying, you believe, if that's the right word, what can be proved. In other words, that which may be trusted, that which is to be accepted, is something which rests on the proven deliverances of either reason or science. It's a very robust point of view, and many of you will know this very, very well. Lewis's perspective is rather different. Lewis's argument is that most of the really important things in life actually lie beyond rational or scientific proof, but nonetheless, they are still reasonable to believe and hold as trustworthy. So you can see immediately there are major issues here about criteria by which you decide whether something is rational, the assessment of evidence, the generation of theories, the comparison of theoretical perspectives with the way the world actually is. And it does, of course, bring us straight into a massive debate, which we need to look at. And I'm going to talk to you now for a few minutes about the shift from modernity to postmodernity in philosophy, because in many ways, Dawkins is quite modern, and Lewis is quite postmodern, but actually we do need to add great big footnotes to both of those statements. So let's just do a little bit of reflection. We could say that modernity, this very significant period in Western culture, which is now over, but was very, very influential while it lasted, really begins with the publication of Descartes' Discourse and Method, or Spinoza's Ethics, back in the 17th century. And the argument here is basically that you're able to find foundations for secure knowledge without recourse to God. In other words, that you are able to lay rational foundations on which you can then build subsequent ideas. In fact, Spinoza in particular, it's really almost like geometry. You begin with the axioms, and then everything else begins to follow. And this leads to ideas like necessary truths, or to use a Cartesian phrase, luminously self-evident propositions. In other words, there are certain things that can be shown to be true, and those are the foundations on which you subsequently build. And those of you who've studied his philosophy will know this was regnant for a very long time. It is, however, now seen as something that is receding into the past. If you like, this kind of foundationalism is being displaced by either anti-foundationalism or, I think more reasonably, non-foundationalism. In other words, that we just cannot have these absolutely secure foundations. And so when you look at the transition to postmodernity, and we're looking at writings like Heidegger's Being and Time, 1927, or Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, or Gadamer's Truth and Method. And the argument here is that those secure foundations just don't exist. If they do exist, they are simply the outcome of intellectual circularity. In other words, it's like a reason determining that reason is reliable. It acts both as judge and jury in the same situation. And so what we see here is a shift that in effect is saying that anything, whether it's philosophy or theology, or even, dare one say it, the natural sciences, are fiduciary. And that's the key word I want you to take away from this lecture, fiduciary. That means, Latin word fiducia, trust, that there are certain things you just have to trust, not being able to show that they are right. They rest on commitments whose truth they are obliged to assume and which they cannot demonstrate. Now again, for most of you, this will be, I hope, something you're familiar with. If not, then this is something you will enjoy engaging, because once you see this sea change, it actually opens up all kinds of ways of thinking. And here's the really important point about this transition. Basically, this is not a problem. In other words, it's not a problem that we cannot prove absolutely certain core ideas on which we actually tend to base our lives and other things. That's just the way things are. That is the paradox of the human epistemic situation, that we are trapped in a situation where we want to know for certain, but we can't. And we have to try and make the best of that and work under those limiting conditions. So if you run with my distinction between modernity and postmodernity, Dawkins is rather modern, Lewis is rather postmodern, but again, it's not quite that straightforward. Dawkins is very, very clear about the need for proof. Faith, he writes, means blind trust in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence. And at one point back there in 1980, he said faith is a kind of mental illness. He's rowed back on that recently, but he's arguing that really there is no place for faith. Faith is about ignoring evidence, running away from evidence. There is no place for faith in science. And here is a quote from The Selfish Gene, which many of you will probably know, in which he talks about this. He writes, faith is a state of mind that leads people to believe something, it doesn't matter what, in the total absence of supporting evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. Now, it's a very influential position, but we do need to interrogate everyone we engage with. In other words, say, well, maybe there's something good here, maybe there's something that's not quite so good. And I want to suggest to you that there are some big questions that need to be asked here. So here is one question we might ask. Look at this statement. Faith leads people to believe something in the total absence of supporting evidence. What would happen if we rephrased that? Faith leads people to believe something in the absence of totally supporting evidence. Do you see the difference between those two statements? Total absence of evidence, absence of totally supporting evidence. Because in science, on the whole, the situation is that the evidence is open to multiple interpretations. It doesn't compel, it suggests, it opens up possibilities. And Dawkins' use of the language of compulsion, the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway, actually suggests that you look at something and it's so clear, it's a very Cartesian idea, it's so clear there's only one outcome for a thinking person. But in science, there are usually multiple outcomes. It's this paradox of the underdetermination of theory by evidence. And that, I think, raises some questions about this. And sure, it's very, very influential. It's very modern. It underlies a new atheist attitude to belief in God. But we do have to ask questions about how reliable it is. I mean, is reality limited to what reason and science can prove? That's a big question. It's a big question in the Faculty of Philosophy, but it's also, of course, an even bigger question here in the Faculty of Theology, where we are thinking about whether, in effect, there are limits to science, limits to reason, and how, if at all, these can be supplemented and augmented. So I'm raising questions about whether this is reliable. I think that's a proper thing to do. As I've said, there are many cases where the evidence supports several outcomes. The idea of proof, strictly speaking, is really limited to logic and mathematics, closed systems. When it comes to making sense of our world through empirical engagement, it gets much more fuzzy. And that's the real problem that I want to explore with you. That in effect, if we look at a classic example, there's a big debate in the sciences. It's a big debate here at Oxford. And the question is this: is there a single universe? Or is there a kind of raft of universes? Many of these things, we're in one of them, but there are zillions of others which we know nothing about. So which of those is right? And the only answer you can give is that the evidence is open to both interpretations. And in the debates here at Oxford, Some of my colleagues in the Faculty of Physics will in effect say, well, we believe the evidence suggests there is simply a single universe. Others will say, well, we believe the evidence suggests that there are many universes, but they are absolutely clear. These are interpretations. The evidence compels you to neither conclusion. It's a matter of judgment, discernment. You've got to try and say which of these seems to be the more reliable, and your decision is a judgment. It's a matter of faith. Simply as that. I believe the evidence is best interpreted like that. Then in brackets afterwards, but things may change as theoretical progression takes place or as new evidence becomes available. So I think there are issues there. And of course, they are broader than this. It's not simply science which has this problem about the multiplicity of possible ways of reading evidence. We are human beings who engage the world and make sense of it. That's part of what it means to be human. And we come up with different answers. And it's not as if the rational person says this and the irrational people say that. It's much more that rationality discloses multiple possibilities and sometimes is unable to adjudicate between them. Hence, Terry Eagleton, used to be English Don at Wadham, went on to be a leading British cultural commentator, writes, "We hold many beliefs that have no unimpeachably rational justification, but are nonetheless reasonable to entertain." In other words, you can hold beliefs that cannot be proved without being irrational. Lots of questions there. What criteria do you use? And so on. But it's a very important issue to explore. And so we might move on then and ask some interesting questions. Some of those are asked by C.S. Lewis. Lewis described himself as an empirical theist who came to faith through induction. Now, this is kind of scientific language, but what Lewis seems to be saying is something like this. That Lewis, like in effect a scientist, would line up the observational evidence. Here is what I experience, here is what I observe in the world, and the question is, what worldview can I draw out from this? Or better, what way of thinking can I align with this and check its reliability? And for Lewis, basically, theism was as an explanatory framework which seemed to make most sense of things. Now, obviously, Lewis has a very interesting history. Some of you will know he began as an atheist. He singled out science and suffering as the two barriers to any kind of belief in God. And of course, Lewis fought in the Great War and saw that as consolidating his atheism. But actually, when he came back to Oxford and secured his fellowship at Magdalen College, he found himself, I think it's fair to say, having growing doubts about the existential adequacy of atheism. Let me explain what I mean by that. His letters of the late 1920s suggest something like this. Lewis thought atheism was probably right, but it was a little bit dull and it didn't really make any difference to his life. And I think that Lewis felt that this was imaginatively impoverishing. And that really is the point I want to explore with you, because for Lewis, the imagination really matters. Lewis argues that things like the imagination, deep intuitions, emotions, are in effect ways of accessing reality. And there's a quote from Surprised by Joy. Some of you will recognize this. The language is lyrical at points. And Lewis is trying to articulate this intellectual dilemma he felt as a young man, thinking atheism is right, but I feel there has to be more. There's something beyond the limits of reason which I have yet to fully discover. He writes, "On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless." And that was Lewis's dilemma, and he solved it in his own way. But what I want you to note is the importance of the imagination, intuition, in effect as for Lewis, indicators of existential traction and engagement with reality. So Lewis basically argued that Christianity was to be seen as a big picture, to be evaluated by its ability to fit in what is observed and experienced. And this is the one-liner which many of you will know. It's from a lecture Lewis gave here at Oxford back in 1945, when he writes, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." In other words, Lewis is articulating in his own way the sort of scientific perspective that a theory, remember the word theory literally means a way of beholding, is to be judged by its capacity to illuminate and colligate the web of experience around us. So it's a very interesting perspective. And you can see immediately this opens up loads of questions about theology and literature, philosophy and the imagination, the natural sciences and the imagination. And some of these I think we need to explore further, but not in this lecture. So let's take Dawkins seriously. I want to begin by saying that Dawkins is absolutely right. You cannot just believe anything. You have to have reasons for what you believe. You need to be able to justify your beliefs. But that's not the same as proving them. Because I think Dawkins is wrong to think we can prove everything we believe. And that may make me seem a little bit postmodern, but it just seems to me to be the way things are. We have to come to terms with this. And if you want a philosopher who takes a very similar view, well, Bertrand Russell will do us very well. Bertrand Russell, atheist philosopher. Well, actually, is he an atheist? I actually think he's an agnostic who chose to adopt an atheist perspective as a matter of lifestyle choice, because his own epistemology does not allow him to be an atheist. It means he has to be an agnostic. In the beginning of his well-known book, The History of Western Philosophy, he writes these words. Ask the question, why do we do philosophy? His answer, it helps us to live without certainty and yet without being paralyzed by hesitation. The point he's trying to get at is, look, we have to face up to the fact that all the big questions of life remain open. They are not settled, and that is unsettling. But nevertheless, we can make choices. We don't have to, in effect, draw back and say, because it's difficult, we won't make a choice. Russell is saying you can make a decision even though the evidence is not absolutely compelling. And I would say actually theology does pretty much the same sort of thing. It just gives us a sort of added layer of interpretation about precisely why that lack of certainty is there. So let's look at an Oxford figure who I enjoy reading. Basically Isaiah Berlin, leading philosopher, but more importantly an intellectual historian. And Isaiah Berlin famously argued that human beliefs fall under three broad categories. Now, you may want to argue with him, but let's just run with him and see where he takes us. First of all, things you can prove by science. Then, things you can prove by logic. And then, unsurprisingly, those you can't prove in either of these ways. That's actually not very interesting. What is interesting is the next point that Berlin makes. His point is that as a matter of empirical observation, every belief that gives life meaning, purpose, and value belongs in that third category. That's just the way it is. And Berlin says that in effect we've got to learn to realize this. And that ought, he says, to lead us to be gracious towards those who disagree with these matters, because none of us can prove that we are right, and therefore we ought to be humble. That's his take on this. But the point I'm going to come back to is that actually we are in a situation where whatever your political or religious or social or ethical beliefs may be, and however much you may feel you're entitled to hold those beliefs, you will not be able to prove that they are right. And we need to think through what the implications of those might be. So let's just do a thought experiment. And I mean, this is just playful. I want you to imagine that you've decided you will only accept ideas that can conclusively and decisively be proved to be right. And I want to ask you, what sort of world would that look like? In other words, what is this like? And, well, here are some examples. There are two examples. I'm absolutely happy to say that those are indubitable. In other words, there are things when you look at them, you say, that is right. You can trust these things. My question would be, where does that take you? I mean, do these give you a reason to get up in the morning? That sort of thing. What is their existential traction? It's a very big question indeed. We'll come back to that. And one of the points I'm going to make is that basically Isaiah Berlin, commenting on the age of reason, which was still, lingering on in his day, but it's kind of faltered since then, just said, look, the great realization of the 20th century is that pure reason simply imprisons us in a cage. And we need to break free from this if we are to lead meaningful lives. Now, some of you will find that unsettling, but, we have to be unsettled from time to time. And the issue is, what are the limits of reason and how can we be rational, yet not realize we have to live with being unable to prove some core beliefs. So there's a fascinating area there to explore in basically Lewis and Dawkins. Here are some ideas you would not be able to accept if you use that very, very strong criterion, decisively and conclusively proved. Any moral, political, or religious ideas. The idea that life has a meaning irrespective of what you think that meaning is. Any notion of what is good or bad, believing there is a God, believing there's not a God. These are just kind of, these are ruled out of court. Again, here at Oxford, a very interesting debate a couple of years back between Rowan Williams, then Archbishop of Canterbury, and Richard Dawkins, chaired by Sir Anthony Kenny, in which Dawkins in effect said, look, actually, I'm agnostic. I'm sort of way 6.7 out of 7 sure that there is no God, but I can't actually prove it. So there's a question there about how we calibrate the reliability of knowledge. But let's move on, because there are other things I want to look at. And I think a very good question to raise is that raised by John Polkinghorne, who's a quantum physicist turned theologian, who in effect just says, look, we have to realize neither science nor religion can entertain the hope of establishing logically coercive proof of the kind that only a fool could deny. No one can avoid some degree of intellectual precariousness, nice phrase, and as a consequent need for a degree of cautious daring in the quest for truth. So that's all very interesting. Here's another question that follows on from that. Does science disprove God? Okay, it's this kind of thing you get at a debating society rather than in serious intellectual discussion, but it is a question that is important and raises some really interesting questions. Dawkins, I think, basically has some very important things to say on this. His argument is that science makes God unnecessary, implausible. Scientific explanations will always win out. The progress of science always entails the retreat of faith, and science proves its assertions, whereas religion just asserts them. So that is kind of a position I think many of you will know. I think this is very interesting. Each of these do need calibration. For example, those of you who've read Thomas Aquinas will probably want to suggest that this does need quite radical revision. But maybe what Dawkins means is the religious people he knows just assert their ideas. But certainly it does rather than neglect the whole philosophy of religion, which I think is a very important discipline and incidentally is very well represented in this faculty. Lewis takes a rather different position. His argument is that science is provisional. In other words, it's on a journey, it keeps changing its mind, and therefore you cannot freeze it and say, this is the way things are. It's rather, this is the way we think they are at the moment, but as time progresses, that will change. Lewis argues there's conceptual space for both science and religious belief, to use his kind of imaginative way of thinking. In fact, if there is a big picture, then science fills in part of that big picture, but you need something else or many other things to fill in the rest of the picture. And his argument about Christianity is that it provides an intellectual framework that makes sense of the scientific enterprise, including both its successes, but also its limits. So again, two very different ways of thinking, both of which I think have a lot to say to us and again generate very, very good discussion. As an example of shifts in our understanding, we might think of changes in cosmology. Those of you who are Swedish, I must apologize to you because I can't pronounce this guy's name. I'm going to just provisionally say it's Arrhenius, but I'm sure some of you will want to critique that. This is from 1906. A century ago. The universe in its essence has always been what it is now. Matter, energy, and life have only varied as to shape and position in space. That was the scientific consensus of 1906. Suppose you were an extremely unwise person in 1906 and said, that's what science says, that's right. End of discussion. I mean, it's not, because science clearly has had cause to rethink this. And you might think of, for example, Edwin Hubble's very famous experiments and so on. But the key point is that the universe is now thought to have begun. We talk about the Big Bang, we talk about an act of origination. And of course, you can immediately see that that is massively important religiously and theological. Scientific advance in this case is very much playing into the whole religious language of creation. Nobody's saying that the scientific language of origination is identical with the religious language of creation, but you can see there is an isomorphism there that really invites further discussion. And so I think there are lots of interesting points to make there. Now, I mentioned Bertrand Russell a moment ago. Russell debated Frederick Copleston in 1948, this very famous debate. Some of you will have read this. And this debate about God actually looked at lots of questions. One of them was, do you need God to safeguard morality? And Copleston actually won that side of the debate. But one of the questions was, do you need God to explain the universe? And Russell won that hands down. If the universe has always been here, no explanation required. And basically, that was the way things were in 1948. But of course, the discussion has moved on since then. In fact, 50 years later, there was a replay between William Lane Craig and Antony Flew, which actually caused Flew some difficulty in dealing with the implications of the beginnings of the universe. So lots of questions there, but here's the one I want to end with. Okay, what's the point of life? Because in effect, what I'm trying to do in this lecture is say there are lots of good intellectual questions. And in many ways, the two very simple questions I've looked at thus far have been cognitive. In other words, how do you generate beliefs? How do you try and make sense of things? What the right relationship of science and faith be? But we're now moving to what we might call existential questions. What's the point of life? These are questions of meaning. And one of the things I want to say is that what distinguishes the humanities from natural sciences is this fundamental concern to deal with questions of human value and human meaning. And there are a number of points I can make here that might help us frame this discussion better. One of them is simply the need to have a robust and rich understanding of human nature. And one of the problems here is that very often people adopt very reductionist accounts of human nature. Like this one. You know, I'm sure you've heard this said, we are just atoms and molecules. And the implication is that we are therefore to be evaluated on the basis of the lowest possible element of our constitutions. And, you know, I mean, let me agree that I am made up of atoms and molecules, and actually all of you are, and so actually is my cup of tea. But what I want to say to you is that if you're philosophy of life or your theology of human nature is unable to distinguish between this cup of tea and me or you, then actually it's not really very good, is it? You need to have a richer account of human nature. And in many ways, that's what theology, that's what philosophy tries to do. Again, Richard Dawkins says that our sole purpose is to reproduce our genes. In effect, we dance to the music of DNA. But again, that might be an element of the human makeup. But it's only one aspect. It's not the big picture. It's only a part of it. And what I want to suggest to you is there's a real need to, in effect, have a richer understanding of human nature, which in effect welcomes science but goes beyond it. And so to use a very simple distinction that gets our thinking going but doesn't stop here, it's not enough to know how things work. We want to know what they mean. And again, I'm a great fan of medicine. My whole family are medical, but in effect, medicine is concerned with working out how the body works and how you fix it when it goes wrong. But most of my medical friends don't really see themselves as pontificating about what the meaning of life might be. How things work, what they mean. Very, very big distinction, and one that I think really is important. This is Jeanette Winterson, a well-known novelist, in a recent book called Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, good title, in effect says, look, we cannot simply eat, hunt and reproduce. We are meaning-seeking creatures. And in effect, she's articulating there what I think would be a widespread consensus within contemporary psychology, that when human beings feel they have found meaning in life, in events around them, then actually they are much more settled. It's almost as if there's something about human nature that compels us to seek meaning and gives us satisfaction and well-being when we do. And I don't know if any of you enjoy reading Nietzsche, but in his book Götz und Dämmerung, The Twilight of the Idols, in his philosophical aphorisms, or if they matter, Nietzsche says, I give a rough translation of his German, you can cope with any how if you have a why. Again, you can cope with any how if you have a why. And the point he's trying to make is that you can actually cope with life better if you feel that there is a meaning, Sinn, beneath events. So it's a very important thing. And of course, this naturally opens up the importance of religion. There's Albert Einstein basically saying, look, there's a lecture on science of religion given at Princeton in 1939. Science can only ascertain what is, not what should be. And outside of its domain, value judgments of all kinds remain necessary. And these are value judgments that science itself cannot deliver. They come from somewhere else. So it seems to me this opens up some really important areas of thought. So this is a Spanish philosopher I rather like, talking about the whole issue of meaning. He writes, scientific truth is characterized by its precision and the certainty of its predictions, but science achieves these admirable qualities at the cost of remaining on the level of secondary concerns, leaving ultimate and decisive questions untouched. That phrase, ultimate questions, comes from philosopher Karl Popper. It's basically really big questions that matter, which actually lie beyond rational or scientific proof. And Popper is quite good on, in effect, saying what the dilemma we face is in valuing these things, yet being unable to categorically prove that they are true. And Ortega just goes on to make this point. He says, look, there's no escape from these ultimate questions. Scientific truth is exact, but it is incomplete. And I agree with him, but that's up for discussion. But one of the things he's saying is, we need a way of enriching science. One of the things I want to say to you is that the questions that are engaged here in the Faculty of Theology and Religion are precisely about those questions of meaning. How you figure out what you mean, how you figure out what the world means, how you construct your own big picture and see yourself as fitting within it. And that, I think, is something that really is very, very interesting. Dawkins himself takes the view that there is no design, purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference in the universe. And Dawkins is careful to say that, when you look at the world, it fits into that way of thinking, but it's consistency there, not proof. And that's a personal way of reading the universe. And of course, there are others. So in many ways, what I'm saying to you in this lecture is simply this. There are lots of big questions. The relationship of sciences and humanities, how you in effect construct your own personal maps of meaning, who's been there before you, and how can they help you do this? And all of these questions are things you'll be able to engage with. Lewis himself is very, very good on this. Some of you read his Voyage of the Dawn Treader, in which one of the children, in effect, answers the question, what is a star, by this response. In our world, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. And the wise old man replies, even in your world, that's not what a star is, but only what it's made of. And so that just gives us this whole idea of emergence, that in effect, you may be able to say this is how things are made up, but there are other things that emerge at higher levels which are unpredictable on the basis of the earlier levels. So this is why I think that the Oxford biologist and philosopher of science, Peter Medawar, is probably right. He won the Nobel Prize for Medicine some years ago, but in his last book called The Limits of Science, Medawar just says, look, we've got to learn to live with the fact that there are big questions that lie beyond the capacity of science to explain. I wouldn't say that's controversial. It just means we need to ask, how do we begin to engage those? So I'm going to wrap up in a moment, then we'll have time for questions, but I'm going to end by just dealing with a work which I think is profoundly unsatisfactory, which just gives you an indication of where the kind of issues that we are looking at in this lecture might take us. There's Alex Rosenberg's book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality, in which he looks at 5 of these kind of questions we've been looking at in these lectures. And basically, he will answer these questions saying, in effect, this is what science says, so that is the answer. Is there a God? No. Okay, that sorts that one out. What's the nature of reality? What physics says it is. Okay, again, that's a very truncated view of reality, but we'll leave that there. What's the purpose of the universe? There is none. Okay, again, we'll just leave that. What's the meaning of life? Ditto. Here's the one that I think made me not so much just saying, oh, this is nonsense, as actually this is dangerous nonsense. Let's see if you agree. What's the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. When I first read that, I thought, no, I've misread this. What I think he must have said is, science is unable to tell us a moral difference between them. But that's not what the text says. I just want to say to you that I couldn't live meaningfully if that statement is right. What's the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There's no moral difference between them. I think there is. I think we live in a world where actually morality matters even more than ever. And so the question of how you stabilize notions of morality is really important. Hey, but that's just me. And I've just opened up lots of questions looking at 2 exemplars who I think are really interesting. There are so many more to engage. And what I'm saying to you simply is that at Oxford we take figures like this very, very seriously. We engage them, we critique them, but we hope to go away enriched and informed and want to follow these questions further. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening. Now we have time for some questions, and again, Margaret explained this to us that we're going to have to use a slightly artificial way whereby if you ask a question, I will then repeat it for the benefit of the camera. Who would like to ask some questions, please? I'm looking for a question. We're looking for questions. Okay, this is a complex question to summarize. But let me say the questioner has asked a very good question about whether analytic truths like 2 and 2 make 4 actually show us that in effect the question of belief in science is much more complex than some might think. One thing I would have to say in responding to this question is that actually, if you look at the philosophy of mathematics, there would be a debate about whether 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a kind of universal truth, or whether actually it's a summary of experience. There's 2, there's another 2, add them together, get 4. Is this a matter of convention? So there's a debate going on about this. So I think you are right to ask whether there is some sort of implicit faith, actually even at that more fundamental level than I've been suggesting. I think I was quite generous in my lecture, in effect just saying I think there are some things we can trust. But you are right, I think, to raise the question as to whether it's quite as straightforward as that. And again, if you look at philosophy of mathematics, you will see these questions being discussed. I think for me, one of the really big questions which emerges from this in relation to science is it a scientific individual who says this is the right answer, or is actually that judgment made not by individuals, but by actually scientific research groups? In other words, it's actually made at a larger level. I think one of the problems here is that very often the history of science is portrayed as if it's about geniuses like Newton or Darwin who individually came to these brilliant answers. Whereas in fact, when you look at history more closely, actually they were talking to other people, they were based on other people, and other people helped them reach their decisions. So you've raised a really interesting question about how scientific beliefs are established and validated. And it's not by individuals, it's by the scientific community gradually crystallizing around options they think are reliable. Thanks very much. Let's move on. I've been asked a question about, in effect, terrorism, which is how do, I suppose, the mindsets of terrorists fit in to the kind of discursive, critical activity we want to encourage here at Oxford. And I would have to say that I quoted Bertrand Russell earlier, and one of Bertrand Russell's big concerns is that there seems to be something about human nature that makes us desire certainty when there is no certainty to be had. And therefore we invent certainty and we enforce it by, in effect, either shutting down discussion or enforcing it physically. And for me, various terrorist ideologies are about certainties that are imposed. And they're imposed precisely because rational reflection shows they are not certainties at all. So I think the kind of point that Isaiah Berlin was making actually really is quite important here. Berlin was saying, look, just face up to the fact that any ideology is at least partly a human construction, and that means you cannot be certain about it. You can say we think it's the best, that's different from saying it's right, and therefore we have to be gracious and judicious in our discussions. But my fear actually maybe echoes your question, which is that actually maybe we live in a world where it is increasingly difficult to have these kinds of discussions. But my response to you, and it's a very predictable response, but it's a very important response, is you can have these discussions here. Okay? Thank you. Coming further forward. The question is to do with, again, the issue I raised about certainty and whether, for example, in the case of mathematics, you sometimes make probabilistic judgments. In other words, I know I can't prove this to be true, but the likelihood of this being true is roughly this. And you're probably thinking of Bayesian approaches, which I certainly take very, very seriously. I think the real difficulty here is how you establish objectivity. The real difficulty is that philosophers often write about rationality without looking at how rationality is actualized in practice. And in my view, and again, this is me, you understand, there'll be lots who would disagree with me, but for me, the most interesting work on this is done by psychologists who in effect look at how human reasoning processes work and how and why they can go wrong. And that really is helpful. But again, the point you're raising is what happens when you're confronted with a situation where it's not yes, no, but it's sort of 60% chance of rain today, that sort of thing, where in effect you have to say, look, I cannot prove this to be true, but I think this is a reliable or probable judgment. And I think the answer is that all of us do try and weigh these things up. The psychologists simply tell us that we may say we're being very rational, but actually quite often we don't identify the criteria that we are using in making these judgments. We don't implement them consistently, and sometimes we already know the answer and then use arguments as sort of post hoc rationalizations of what we want to be true. So it's complicated, but hey, it's a great discussion to have. Okay, I think we've run out of time. Now, wonderful questions. Thank you so much.